After the hour, I think now is a fine time to get rolling. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tony Seidel. I work as the Forest Health Program Coordinator with the South Dakota Department of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Before we begin today's workshop, I just want to give a quick disclaimer. Today's workshop will be recorded, with this recording being placed on the department's YouTube channel for public viewing once it's reviewed and approved by the department technical support team. The Department of Agriculture and Natural Resources is an equal opportunity provider and wants to encourage participation. However, if you would not like to be a part of today's live workshop, an email will be sent to everybody registered with a link to the recording once it's updated or uploaded. All participant microphones and videos have been turned off upon entering the meeting. We ask to keep it that way due to bandwidth concerns. We will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. Should you have any questions that come up during Dr. Ball's presentation, please add it in the chat box and we'll address as many as we can in the allotted time. Society of American Foresters continuing education credits are available, and I believe we could get ISA certified arborist credit for this workshop as well. If you haven't already sent your certification information to my colleague Patricia, please do so. Otherwise, you can add it in this chat box during the presentation. With that said, I welcome everybody to today's workshop about pine engraver beetle management. In recent years, pine engraver beetle populations have been on the rise in the Black Hills of South Dakota. And while these beetles do not disturb forest landscapes at the same size as the mountain pine beetle, generally between 2 and 10 acres in size, we have seen noticeable impacts on public and private lands alike. Today, we are joined by Dr. John Ball, Forest Health Specialist with the Department of Agricultural and Natural Resources, as well as SDSU Professor and Extension Forester. Dr. Ball will draw from his experience as an entomologist on the cutting edge of science and touch on all things pine engraver beetle. Dr. Ball, the floor is yours.
All right, well, thank you, Tony. Great introduction. And again, Tony, I appreciate you timing this session as you did, because this is a good time to go over this. So everyone, I'll get started here. I've titled this Pine Beetles. The focus is really going to be Pine Engraver Beetle. But I'm also going to touch a little bit on mountain pine beetle, turpentine beetle, and then a few other problems that we have in the Black Hills. Quite often they're confused with pine engravers, so let's just discuss them all here. But the bulk of the time will be on the pine engravers. Well, first of all, just a tad bit of history. Mountain pine beetle, and that's what you're looking at in 1997 at the beginning of it. And Tony had it right. With mountain pine beetle, it seems to take out larger swaths of trees, as everyone watching this is probably familiar with. But that epidemic, which fortunately ended at about 2015, depending on how you're splitting hairs, and started in about 96, 97, took out about 16 million trees throughout the hills. And what's interesting is if you take a look at the outbreaks, starting with our original one that in the 1890s, in the 28 years of outbreaks, in other words, about half the time from 1890s to present was during outbreaks. So think of that, half the time was in outbreaks. We lost about 30 million trees. And then we only lost another 500,000 in the 67 years between epidemics. And I think just about everyone regards this latest one probably was the worst in terms of losses. Now, the oldest one is a little bit hard to determine exact numbers. It could have been worse. We didn't have the technology back there to take a look at them. So let's just say the bookends right now, the first one and the last one, were probably the worst ones we've experienced, and there'll be another one of these days. I mean, the issue with this, it's not a cyclical insect, but it's periodical. Populations will climb, and then they'll drop based upon a lot of factors. The amount of host material, a big one. Do you have a lot of pine trees, and are they big pine trees? And then a little bit of drought kicks it off, and once it kicks it off, it doesn't matter what the climate's like. That population is going to climb as long as they have the food source available and as long as they don't have a lot of competition from other insects. The engraver beetle population, though, really kicked up last year in 2021. And we did a little workshop then, and we're doing one now just as a good reminder to everyone that, you know what, we still got to be actively managing for this insect in 2022. And if we take a look at where all these bark beetles kind of partition themselves out in the tree, it's kind of interesting. The engraver beetles, and we do have more than one species, attack the dying tops and branches, generally speaking. In other words, if you look up 50, 60-foot tree, they own that top 10, 20 feet. They're going to go for the smaller diameter wood. And ideally, the top and branches are dying. They're generally not capable of attacking healthy trees. Because of that, they also infest green logging slash. Any down material is their favorite food source because it's still green. They have the tissue that they need to feed on. They won't live on dead tissue. But nevertheless, they don't have the resin flow that's going to try to pitch them out. Mountain pine beetle, typically between about 3 and 50 feet. It's not an exact thing, but they're not usually tops. And the reason for that is the thickness of the phloem tissue, which they feed in, gets so narrow by that point. It's not enough of it to support their young. So they're going to want trees that are larger diameter, have a thicker layer of phloem tissue where all the sugars are. So we're going to find them in about 3 to 50 feet, and they're going to attack, generally speaking, healthy trees, but their sheer numbers will allow them to overcome the defenses. And then at the bottom, we have the ankle biters, the turpentine beetles. These are the largest. Generally speaking, they're making very few tunnels through the tree, so not enough to really do a lot of damage. They're going to attack trees that are stressed. I've seen them attack even stumps. They usually don't go over healthy trees, but you know where I find them? Find them a lot in housing developments going up around the hills. Someone builds a new home, causes some damage to the trees, then wonders why these pitch tubes are around the base. Mountain pine beetle is still out there. I want to remind everybody that its populations have plummeted, but it's there waiting. I catch them every year. Here's one that we caught in 2020, for example, that was pitched out and killed. Right now, you're going to find mountain pine beetle in lightning struck trees, and you're going to find them in small diameter trees where they have some success. Why? Because their numbers have plummeted. It's not a case that they went away. It's not a case that they disappeared. They're out there. And at some point in the future, a date we really can't predict, but probably within 20 years or so, they'll start coming back. As a reminder, they're all poor flyers, this being the mountain pine beetle. What they need is dense stands. Why? The air's stiller, and they need that for their communication system. If you ever looked at mountain pine beetle, it's my last picture on it. This is the pocket. As Tony mentioned, that pocket expands and expands and expands. Why? The pioneer beetles that find the trees that are most susceptible to attack are going to attack those. They're going to release a pheromone that's going to attract other beetles to that tree. As the population expands in that tree, those beetles produce another pheromone to tell the beetles coming to the party, go attack one of the surrounding trees. And so we get these pockets that just continually expand. They might expand to 20 trees. They might expand to thousands of trees, as people have seen throughout the hills. But they really depend on cooperative attack to kill large trees. And the tree's health is not important once they begin attack. Sheer numbers alone will allow them to overcome the pitch defenses. And a good way to tell them apart is for mountain pine beetle, they're going to make a very long egg gallery because it's a mom and a dad. And mom's going to lay the eggs along that large gallery called the egg gallery. And those little larval galleries, where each one of those eggs have hatched, those larvae are going to go out from it and at the end form their pupa cell and then emerge as adults. Another big difference you're going to notice between mountain pine beetle galleries that you're seeing here and pine engraver galleries, which I'll show you later, is mountain pine beetle galleries are filled with that dust. The Ips galleries, the pine engraver beetles, are much cleaner. So just looking at that egg gallery alone, you could look at it and say, well, that's probably mountain pine beetle. But the other way you tell is they're in these very long single egg gallery. And here's another picture of them. And that you can see why that could kill a tree. Turpentine beetle, as I mentioned, we see those every year. We saw them during the epidemic. We're seeing them now. They never go away, but populations never seem to build up either. But if you look at the base of the tree and you find these very large globs of pitch, and again, the base usually at ground level, but maybe even as high as 3 feet, but usually not above that, they're going to attack the bottom of the tree. And here's one. This one's on a home site where they did some construction, and sure enough, these globs came up. Now, with these, they tend to be individual attacks. They make one long, large gallery to it, so it's not not enough to disrupt the movement of food throughout the tree, unlike the mountain pine beetle or even the pine engraver beetle. And so usually the trees survive these attacks. What they tell you instead is this tree's stressed. They are the biggest of the pine beetles, though. The turpentine beetles might be 3/8 of an inch, have kind of that reddish color, hence the other name, red turpentine beetle. The mountain pine beetles are a little smaller, and most of the pine engraver beetles are much smaller than that even. So let's get started on them. The engraver beetles, also known as ips, that's a scientific name to it. So some people just refer to them as ips beetles. It's easy to say as well, but that's the one we've seen really increasing over the last 2 years. In 2020 and part of 2021, there were some fairly big populations and killing a lot of trees. Way you tell is the pine engraver beetles have these little points on their backside, on the rear. They're at the end of the wing covers. So if you flip one over, and again, the pine engraver beetles may be only 1/8 of an inch. The 6-spine beetles, because they'll have 6 spines rather than 4 spines, they're going to be about 3/16 of an inch, but they're both about the size of a apple seed or smaller. So they're going to be fairly small beetles, and the pine engraver beetle very small. And if you look at the back of them, there'll be 4 points on the back. The 6-spine, which we also have throughout the hills, is going to have 6 spines on the back. And as I mentioned, they're going to be a little bit larger in size, but those spines are what you use to identify that you have a pine engraver beetle rather than mountain pine beetle, which will be a little bit larger, or the turpentine beetles, which will be much larger. The winter is usually spent as adults beneath the bark of even fallen trees, recently fallen trees, or in the litter beneath infested trees. So right now, going out there and pulling the bark away in a tree is not a good way to measure the population of pine engraver beetles. Now, it works well for mountain pine beetle back in the day when we were doing our surveys, because the larvae would be beneath the bark. But right now, you can pull bark away and you'll find adults, but it doesn't tell you the whole population. Right now, you can find them in the litter beneath trees as well, usually in stands that are already infested. Or, as I mentioned, in trees that fell last fall that were still green, you'll find adults underneath them as well. But come this spring, when we start getting day temperatures in the 60s for at least 2 consecutive days, the adults will begin emerging from their shelter. Again, their shelter either being the duff beneath the trees or in the trees that have fallen. And last year, and this is from Weather Underground and looking at Custer, South Dakota, by the time we were getting towards the end of May 16th to May 22nd, we had a nice period of consistently warm weather. Now, we had a little pocket of that at the end of April, but at that time, about third week of May, the adults were starting to come out of the litter layer. And if you disturb that litter layer with machinery or even by walking through it, you could actually get some adults coming out of it. And last spring at a workshop we had down down near Rapid, literally as the group was walking through right after that ground had been disturbed, the adults were beginning to fly out of it. So it was very noticeable. And we actually, in that stand there, I put a trap up right afterwards, and you can see I began collecting adults almost immediately. So the adults are the overwintering stage, but they're not always beneath the bark of the tree. You're also going to find them in the litter layer. And as the temperatures warm, again, consistently about 60, that's when they start flying. It's usually sometime in mid-April to mid-May. Again, depends on the year and depends on where you are in the hills. Sometimes the northern hills a little bit later, and certainly higher elevations, it could actually be end of May sometimes. But those adults are going to go for any green fall material. That's their preferred food. Any storm damage, anything that came down during the winter, anything that's still green, any slash piles that are still green are going to be preferred sites rather than standing trees. And last year, I went through end of May, early June, and sure enough, I could start finding the adults burrowing into these slash piles here. And what you'll find is that those galleries are empty. There's no real frass behind them. And this is one of the adults that's coming in. Usually in the case of the engraver beetles, dad chooses the tree, releases a pheromone, calls in females, oftentimes 3, sometimes as many as 6, occasionally 1. And what you'll find is they'll mate and each female will radiate out from that common tunnel. So it'll be an X or a Y shape quite often. And that's typically the case of what you're going to see here, that egg galleries. And then from that, the larval galleries, rather than just one egg gallery coming through. And the picture I'm showing is the same thing. You'll notice that Y there, as each of the females have gone out their own separate ways. And then those little tunnels coming off of them are the larval galleries. But you'll notice, quite different from the mountain pine beetle, all those tunnels are pretty clean. They don't pack frass behind them as they're tunneling through. Here's the beginning of one. You can barely see the adult in there, but nevertheless there is, and you can just see the start of the females burrowing out from this common nuptial chamber, we call it, where the mating occurred. And on one of them, you can just see the eggs have hatched and the larvae are beginning to form their own little galleries coming out from them. Now, the adults are small. The larvae are even smaller, a very tiny bit of white. Mountain pine beetle, we used to say they were about the size of a grain of rice. This is about half the size of a grain of rice. So they're very tiny and easy to miss. The eggs are going to hatch in about 10 to 14 days. So you figure sometime in April, sometimes as early as April, if we get a warm spring, sometimes as late as the end of May, again, depending on the weather, we're going to have the adults flying, creating that nuptial chamber. They will mate. Females will form their chambers out from there, or their galleries out from there, and the eggs are going to hatch in about 10 to 14 days. And so usually by early June, it's pretty easy to pull away green fallen material or green slash and find a lot of activity going on underneath them. You'll find this dust on the outside as the adults have burrowed in. And then you pull the bark away, you'll find the larvae feeding out through there. Now, they're going to feed for about 3 weeks. So now we're sometime into anywhere from end of May to mid-June or so, again, depending on the year. And they're going to form a little pupal cell at the end of theirs. And now we're going to get that second generation of adults coming out. So the adults are going to merge in about 10 days. Now that's where the problems begin for us. In the spring of the year, those adults that have overwintered are going to go for any fallen material or any green slash. That's going to be their preference. But now the second generation is coming out in June. Unless we had a late May snowstorm, and we've had those, or some windstorm that laid down a lot of new green material, they're probably pretty much through with that. The second generation is going to go for trees, standing trees, if there's no other source of food for them. Again, they have to go for a stress tree because they can't overcome the defenses as easily as mountain pine beetle. But it's that second generation that we really get concerned about in terms of forest management. Point out here with our little chart here is that you're going to find the egg stage, again, anytime from April to August. You're going to find adults year round. They're always out. Sometimes we find more than others. And you're going to find larvae out there in midsummer as well as pupae. But when we checked catches, take a look at this. We do get that huge spike and sometime in about the middle of May, as I mentioned. That's when we start getting consistently warm weather and are coming out. And look at how high those trap catches stay all the way through end of July, beginning of August. And so once that population picks up, they're out. You've got ones that emerged earlier already going through. You can literally have first and second adults out at the same time in many cases. So it's those summer months, you take a look at that, June particularly, where we can create a lot of problems in terms of how we manage trees for pine engraver beetles. I want to mention too, we have that 6 spine out there as well. And the reason I mention that is some people do confuse this one, which is a little bit bigger, with the mountain pine beetle, not because of the way it looks, but the damage that it creates. This one will produce pitch tubes. The pine engraver beetle, also known as the 4 spine, is much smaller. It really has to attack trees that are in serious decline or recently dead. The 6 spine will attack trees that are stressed, but not stressed so much that they can't produce pitch anymore. And so you could find in 2020 and 2021 trees in pockets that had these globs of pitch on them. And if you didn't know any better, you'd say, oh my gosh, I'm looking at mountain pine beetle, the beginning of an attack of mountain pine beetle. But instead, you were looking at pine engravers, and the 6 spine. And I might mention during the mountain pine beetle epidemic, we would sometimes come across pockets that were not mountain pine beetle, but were actually the 6 spine engraver beetle that was attacking the trees. And sometimes the pitch tubes are rather small on these trees. You can see this was going after a fire damaged tree. And here again is another one where you pull the bark away, and underneath there, you didn't find the one long gallery for mountain pine beetle. Instead, you found the X's and the Y's for this one, the 6 spine engraver beetle. But I do want to point out this one will attack standing trees fairly readily, particularly that second generation. So how do you know you have engraver beetles in your trees? Well, you look at the tops. And by the way, the last couple of weeks, I've been getting more and more calls from people out in the Black Hills that have noticed as they look up in their tree, they're seeing woodpecker damage. Or what's happened is they're walking through their little forest stand and they start noticing some of the bark on the ground, and not just some bark flakes, which is normal for ponderosa pines, but they look up and they're finding patches of bark. They look up and notice that a lot's missing. What they're probably looking at is woodpecker activity, woodpeckers going after the engraver beetles because they're just beneath the bark. And here's a great picture that I took in 2020. You can see what we have here is slash piles. And if you notice the color on those slash piles, they're a little off. Slash piles dry too quickly and the beetles move to the trees. And the woodpeckers then move to the trees. And you can see in a lot of these smaller diameter trees, the woodpeckers have removed almost all of the bark in their search for those beetles. And so one way to tell if you've already got engraver beetles in your stand or had them is you'll start noticing woodpecker activity if the adults are still underneath the bark. If they're in the duff layer, you're not going to find woodpeckers after them. But my point is you can find them in the tree and in the duff, not just one or the others. So if you know some of the tops are picking up some woodpecker activity at this time, it's a pretty good indication you've got pine engraver beetles in those trees. And you probably even have more pine engraver beetles in the ground beneath those trees. Everybody waiting to come out and attack anything green this spring. So when do engraver beetles become a problem? Well, they become a problem when it's dry. It has to be dry. I look back at the weather records, and if you take a look from 2013 to 2020, we had some incredibly wet years except for one. And then 2020, it went dry. If you look at 2019, we had a lot of spring rains there. In fact, the whole year was wet. But a real common thing we find with pine engraver beetles is if you look at the April to June precipitation, If it's 70, if it's less than 75% normal average, you're going to have a pine engraver beetle problem. You look at 2019, it was wet. You look at our average, it was above our average by almost 2 inches. But then you look at 2020, we only had 6.6. That's why we saw such a increase in 2020. Now, 2021, we had just about the average, a little bit better than average, but we had so many engraver beetles out there that we are still seeing damage. If it goes into wet this year, we may be okay, but who knows what spring's going to show. When you have a fire, you get pine engraver beetle populations increasing. Why? Because you have a lot of stressed trees. So that's another good time for attacks. And we had a lot of fire damaged trees and we had a drought. When you get that combination, you're going to see engraver beetle populations increase. And we have storm damage. This is that picture of that tornado that ran through down near Custer. You get a lot of green fallen wood. And we went down there and it's amazing the dust piles that were on those trees. The beetles were hammering them. Well, now how do we manage them? Well, it's how you manage slash as best you can. Slash management, avoid creating slash now till June. If you're laying down slash piles, you're done. And the reason being that slash is still going to be green come spring as the adults are coming out here. And again, we've had adults coming out even in early April. So we might only be 6 weeks away from adults coming out. We might be 8 weeks away. But we get a little snow between now and then, something to keep it moist. And you've got fresh slash there, and they're going to go for that slash. Well, you might say, what's the problem with that? That slash will dry out by the time that second generation comes out. You've built up the population. There's no more green material for them to go to. So then they will go to the trees. Now, if you have an incredibly wet year, the trees are so healthy they can repel them. That's why some people say, well, you know, in 2018, I laid down some slash. I didn't see any problem. We had a wet year then. Don't count on wet years. Assume it's going to be the worst. And that's why we saw slash piles in 2020. People that put them down in March and that, an amazing problem. And we saw that continue into 2021 just because of the high population of IPs. There was a lot out there. And as I say, you could pull them out underneath those slashes. Here was one that was very common. These were slash piles that were put down in May, the previous year, and they dried right out. So they collected a lot of beetles, but by June they dried out and the beetles attacked the surrounding trees. In fact, in 2020, it was very easy to see places that had been cut, thinnings done, slash created in May, probably about the worst time to do it. And then that summer, the adults that were emerging from it then went to the surrounding trees. Now, you can do what we call green slash. You cut the slash, you've done it in March, for example, but you're going to go out about every 6 weeks then. So you're going to do it in April, you're going to do it in June, you're going to do some in August, and you're going to lay more down. And these piles are going to be scattered about 200 to 400 feet apart. What you're doing is a green chain. So you're putting them down and there's always fresh green material for them. And if you continue to put down green material, they'll go to that rather than the trees. Our problem is, do you have a ready supply of slash throughout that time period? If you can't continue it, you're going to run into problems. So why this is a good technique, it's a technique that in practice, it may be difficult to start and continue. Another is creating these large piles, slash piles 10 to 20 feet wide, 8 or more feet high. Now, this will work. Here's how it works. The piles are so big, the beetles, as they emerge, will just burrow deeper into that slash because you reach in there, that material's still green inside. It's those piles that are like 6 feet tall that'll dry out by summer. The problem with these, though, remember, that population is just building and building and building in there. Eventually, they're going to come out. So usually with the piles, you want to burn them. Well, if you're in a drought, how do you burn them during the winter? So again, the problem is you can make these huge piles, but at a certain point, maybe by the end of the summer, those piles are no longer attractive. There's no green in the interior and the adults are coming out. In the old days, you just go through there and burn them and kill a lot of the beetles. But again, do you know whether or not you're going to be able to burn them? Lopping and scattering does work, and it even worked during the drought to some degree. In other words, rather than piling the slash you're cutting, and again, if you said, John, I've still got to do a little bit more, lop and scatter it. Lop and scatter it so it dries out much quicker. And we found in places that they didn't pile the brush in these 6-foot piles that will definitely dry out by the time the second generation comes out. But instead, they just cut it in a smaller material and lopped and scattered it. That material dried out pretty quickly. And we didn't get a lot of damage to the trees that were surrounding it. Now, again, ideally, you've lopped and scattered it by now as well. But my point is, anything you can do to get that material to dry out faster works. And again, the smaller the diameter, the better. Now, chipping. We can chip a little bit longer. If you say, well, John, I'm out there managing the stands and I'm going to chip them instead. But usually by mid-March, the latest, we want to be done. The reason being is we could get adults flying even in early April, and even large populations if it starts getting warm and stays warm then. What happens is beetles will be attracted to areas that you've chipped. Reason being is you've got a lot of those volatiles, the odors of the trees present. But then when they get there, they don't find any green material to attack. So they will attack the standing trees, even that first generation, if they're drawn into an area into which they can't find anything else to feed on. So chipping, you got maybe a month, preferably by the end of this month. You'll be done chipping until starting at the end of the flight period. Otherwise, chipping's great. But remember, chipping's a calling card. It's going to release those odors because the chips will still be green here in a few more weeks after you put them down. And those can end up attracting them. Now, the other thing you can do to help it is if you can kind of pull the chips away from within 6 feet of the trees. Well, that's a lot of work in a stand, isn't it? And if you look at this stand, you're going to almost rake all the chips out of it. But I got this picture. Why? Because the beetles started attacking early on, along with turpentine beetles. And the call was, well, mountain pine beetles are attacking my trees, and they're doing it in May. No, they weren't mountain pine beetles. They were the 6-spine engraver beetles and turpentine beetles that were attacking them because they were drawn into the site because of all the fresh volatiles, and the only thing they could attack were the standing trees. And don't stack fresh cut split firewood by these trees. Even this last year, we saw problems with it. I'll bet everybody here is surprised to know that those standing trees were attacked because what did they do? They took the trees, cut them in smaller pieces, and then tossed all this green material that they cut in May of last year and stacked it around the larger trees. And so sure enough, Ips beetles, the engraver beetles, attacked the trunks and the tops, and the turpentine beetles attacked the base. So don't be doing this at all. And you can see on this picture, those are turpentine beetles that attacked the base of the trees that they were planning to keep in their little housing area. And again, it's not because they crawled over, it's because of the odor from the fresh cut wood, and the tops in that were attacked by yips. So don't put a lot of fresh wood around any of these trees you do want to keep. And then spray. If you're in an area that last year you still saw pine engraver damage, and if you have some high value trees next to the home that you're concerned about, then we do recommend spraying. Now, we're not advocating widespread spraying for engraver beetles, just to protect some trees on a site to which you saw engraver damage or losses the last 2 years. So if you've got that, it does make sense to go out and spray. The thing with engraver beetles, you got to spray the entire canopy. You got to get all those branches up in the canopy of the tree, as well as the trunk. So you're spraying higher than mountain pine beetle. And that means you're probably going to need a sprayer with a lot of pressure to be able to reach the bark and actually the crevices in the bark. This is why I recommend to homeowners that it's best to hire someone to come out and do the spraying than do it yourself. Having said that, I was called out to a site last year where a guy said the spraying wasn't working. Well, that's what he was spraying them with. A little pump sprayer, you're not going to get the penetration of the chemical on the trunks of the trees, and you're not going to get it high enough, even if you're standing on a ladder. And don't stand on a ladder. Trapping's best left as a means of monitoring, and that's what we're doing as the division out there. So we'll put up traps. We will in the spring in various locations to see what we're collecting. And you can see they're collecting them here. That little bit of cheese we put in there is to kill them so they don't fly out of our traps. But really, trapping like this using lures is not a good means to trap out a stand. I won't say it can't be done, but it requires some very particular circumstances to do that. So traps are best left as a means for us to use to monitor the population than it would be as a landowner to say, I'm going to go out there and trap and see if I can trap enough of them that I can reduce the population. But we do it. We put a couple lures on these. Lures that smell like a nice tree to attack, and lures that smell like other beetles that have already found that tree. And they'll all come in, and essentially they go down these funnels, and they really don't come back out of them. But we put that little block of, quote, cheese, little block of insecticide in there to make sure they die when they get to the bottom. And then we'll check these. Literally, we can have it where you come back in a week and that cup is full and they're spilling over. And you can also have it where you come back in 2 weeks and there's only 2 in there. It just depends on the area that you're trapping and the size of the population. So again, monitoring only is really about the best. And to come out and only catch that many in 2 weeks, well, we've got a population, but not a big population. So again, it allows us to kind of get a measure of what's going on out there. I want to mention before I go on to other pine problems, here's something that is a little disturbing, not unexpected, but a little disturbing. Both the Forest Service entomologist, Kurt Allen, a name that most of you know as well, that works a lot on the federal lands, and myself, and we work together quite a bit. As you know, last year we got enough rains, and guess what? That population kind of disappeared. We did not see damaging continuing into the fall. Now, that might mean we're going to be okay this spring. All right. But if it goes dry, they'll come right back. So we're hoping the rains continue, or we get good rains, and that huge population has declined. Now, that doesn't mean get back in bad habits and start cutting too late, but it might mean that we're over with it. Usually pine engraver populations pop up for 2 or 3 years in a row. This would be the 3rd year. And so it's not out of the question, but what we were surprised at is a lot of material that went down didn't continue to track them late into the year. It just kind of, they've disappeared. That population crashed enough. And let's hope that continues. Well, we have some other pine problems out there worth mentioning. One is the Zimmerman pine moth. And what you'll find there is globs of pitches. But the globs of pitches are almost bubblegum size, masses even. And they're going to be at the whorls of the branches. A lot of the housing developments, HOAs, from Spearfish all the way down to Custer, you'll see them in their trees. You can also find them in the forest as well, but usually there's going to be found near developments more often. And these are top killers. It'll break off, or branch killers. The whole branch will break away from the tree. What they do is they weaken the structure because they like to burrow in about where that branch is connected to the trunk. The larvae are burrowing into the wood beneath that pitch from about April to August. So if you use a chisel there and you pull this, that pitch masses away, you'll find this very long larvae underneath there. You will not confuse that with any of the bark beetles. And they're going to come out at about 1700 to 1800 growing degree days, usually sometime in August. Mid-August for the southern hills, late August for the northern hills. It's a moth that comes out. That's the pupal skin, the cocoon to the adult moth. And they'll fly, lay eggs again on the whorls of the branches. So they're going to start seeing egg hatch usually by the end of August, early September. Now, what's interesting, when that egg hatches, that little larvae doesn't burrow into the tree right away. It actually gets underneath a bark flake, forms this little webbing, what we call a hibernaculum. It's not a true cocoon, and will over the winter in that. And then comes spring at about 150 growing degree days. So sometime in April or May, they'll emerge from that, crawl along the trunk, and then burrow into the wood, again, right about where a whorl's connected. And that's why we'll get those big globs of pitches. And so one of the ways to manage this is also to spray. We're not recommending any particular chemical or discouraging you from using any other. This is only as an example. But permethrin, the active ingredient, is probably one of the best. So you're going to find something that's labeled for pines and Zimmerman pine moth, and it's going to contain permethrin, and you're going to have that sprayed in mid-April to kill those larvae as they're coming out before they burrow into the wood. And then you're going to repeat in August to kill mom as she's laying eggs, or to kill the young larvae as they hatch from the eggs and begin to move along. And you want to make sure you're able to spray the trunk of the tree, not the needles. There's also Sawyer beetles out there, and any declining tree, you're going to find these. The biggest thing, you pull the bark away and it looks like sawdust underneath there. They'll burrow through a tree and just outcompete anything. In fact, one of the interesting things that's coming out of the mountain pine beetle epidemic that ended is what we noticed Kurt Allen and I in the Black Hills, and other forest health people throughout the West noticed that in the beginning of the epidemic, trees that were attacked by mountain pine beetle weren't attacked by the Sawyer beetles until almost a year later. As the epidemic started to peak in 2012, we found that Sawyer beetles were coming in right after the mountain pine beetles, and literally they ate the mountain pine beetles out of house and home. It's beginning to look like Sawyer beetles may have played a significant role in causing the epidemic to end. Normally, though, again, they're just going to go for the dead and dying trees. But again, you pull it away and find sawdust. That's not pine engraver beetles. Doesn't mean they hadn't been in there earlier. But those are Sawyer beetles, and the larvae look quite different. They're going to be big. They can get almost finger size, and they have a very large area right behind their head there on the thorax there. So they look kind of swollen, and you won't find little legs on them. So these are not going to look like the Zimmerman pine moth larvae, and they're certainly not looking like the pine engraver or the mountain pine beetle larvae, which are far, far smaller. And these are the adults of the Sawyer beetles. You'll find them flying around. They have the longhorn beetles, are also called, because those very long antennae. They buzz around, they scare tourists, but really not a threat to us by any means. But they do make these, what we call egg niches in the trunks of trees. Looks like someone took a Phillips screwdriver and stabbed it. The female lays eggs in those. And so if you notice these on the bark of the tree, well, that's a tree that they've chose to attack. Again, it's probably a tree that's already been attacked by the pine engraver beetles because it was stressed. Now it's maybe dead or near dead, and the Sawyer beetles will come in and finish it off. A few others problems. We have a lot of Diplodia tip blight. Now that's a fungus disease. And what you'll notice on these trees, the top will be green, as you see in the picture here, but the lower branches will be affected, and there'll be pockets of this in the hills because of hail. Now, by the way, hail doesn't bring it in. It's a tree that's already been infected, And the hail damage is a stress and causes the disease to present. Now, drought will do that as well. And so we've seen a big increase in Diplodia tip blight out there as well. Some of the other signs and symptoms of Diplodia tip blight is you'll find that the tips will be stunted. They won't produce needles of the normal length because it's affecting the twig, the tips. And so it kills these off before they fully expand. And then you'll also find that the needles will hang throughout the winter into the next year. So if you look at a tree, the lower branches, you got a lot of these hanging gray needles and then a lot of stunted little tips. That's a pretty good indication that that tree is infected with Diplodia tip blight. And the trees usually don't die because those side shoots will take over. It'll be deformed. But I will say during the drought, the Diplodia tip blight finished off a number of trees. And I saw some hillsides where trees hadn't been attacked by the engraver beetles, but they had been killed finally by repeated infestations of Diplodia tip blight. One of the interesting things is the disease will overwinter on the cones. If you find these little black dots on the cones, that's an indication that the trees standing above it have the disease. Now, I also want to point out, this is a disease that's often misdiagnosed. There's less of it out there probably than people think there is. It's a big problem, but it's not the only problem out there. And we do testing for it to make sure it's Diplodia tip blight. But in terms of treatments, the fallen cones will release spores as well as infection in the tips. And again, we can do sampling for that, but that's what the little spores look like. That's what we get in our lab. This is easy to treat. You treat the terminal buds when they're expanding. And so as the buds are beginning to open and swell, you repeat that 10 days later because now the needles are beginning to form and you need to protect those needles by having a chemical shield over them. And then a third spray about 14 days later after the needles have fully formed. That does not cure a tree. That just stops new infection. Typically, you'll treat for 2 years or 3 years, then stop for several years. The previous years we had, 2017, 2018, 2019, we had wet springs that really allowed this disease to just bloom. 2020 and 2021, it was dry in the spring, so we didn't see the disease expand as much, but since the trees were stressed, we saw trees declining because of previous infections. We'll see what 2022 brings. Here again, it's a fungicide, Mancozeb, and again, these two products are examples only. They're not endorsements, nor does it mean other brands do not work. But Mancozeb is a common one, and there's a number of products out there that can be used to spray. Once again, you need to get a sprayer that can spray the whole tree. And then some other things I'm finding. I'm still seeing vole damage out there. In the little pines, I'm already seeing that even with the snow, you'll see some of them, they're dying. And you pull the snow away, or you just pull the debris away, and you'll find something's gnawed the base where the snow was. And those are voles. So that population seems to be increasing, and I'm seeing more vole damage. And then some other seeing the pouch fungus. It's a sap rot. You see these little pouches along the side of the tree. That's a tree that's dead. It's a zombie tree. But some people from a distance will confuse those with pitch clobs from bark beetles. But nope, it's just that. But it also tells you got a tree that's probably going to fall. Well, that's everything there. I wanted to make sure I finished up just a tad early, either reward you for paying attention, you get out a little earlier, or to answer any questions that we have. If anybody has any questions, this is probably a good time to ask them. Again, there's my email address if you have additional questions afterwards, but always happy to answer the questions. I'm stationed in Brookings, South Dakota, but I travel out to the Black Hills and during the sometimes often every week. And starting this next week, I'll be coming out about every other week until the growing season starts early April. So if you have questions or need me to stop, I'm more than happy to do so. And we also have a number of other foresters that are stationed out in the hills that can help you as well. So at this point,